What drives a human being to take not just one life, but hundreds, thousands, even millions? By the end of this video, you'll understand how one man's twisted ideology led to the deaths of over 40 million people. But first, let's explore the dark path that brought humanity to that point, and perhaps more importantly, understand how seemingly ordinary people can transform into history's greatest monsters. Hello everyone, today we're diving into one of history's darkest topics, the individuals responsible for the most deaths in recorded history. This isn't just a list of numbers, it's a journey into the minds and motivations of those who've committed history's worst atrocities. Before we begin, a quick note, we're focusing on leaders and individuals who directly ordered or caused mass deaths, not soldiers following orders. Let's begin. 10 Pol Pot 1925 to 1998. Death toll 1.5 to 2 million people. Born Salazar to a relatively wealthy farming family, nothing in Pol Pot's early life suggested the horror he would eventually unleash. As a young man, he studied radio electronics in Paris, where he became involved with the French Communist Party. This exposure to communist ideology would later mutate into one of history's most radical experiments in social engineering. When he returned to Cambodia, he found a country in turmoil, caught between colonial powers and Cold War politics. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge movement promised a return to Cambodia's ancient greatness through radical agrarian reform. But what began as a nationalist movement quickly descended into a nightmare. On April 17, 1975, his forces captured Phnom Penh. Within 24 hours, the entire city was evacuated at gunpoint. Hospitals were emptied, patients still connected to IVS forced to walk or crawl into the countryside. The Khmer Rouge believed that cities were symbols of capitalism and had to be destroyed. What followed was Year Zero, perhaps history's most radical attempt to restart society from scratch. Money was abolished. Books were burned. Anyone wearing glasses was suspected of being an intellectual and could be executed on the spot. Children were turned against parents, students against teachers. The regime's motto became chillingly clear: to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. 9 Leopold II of Belgium 1835 to 1909. Death toll 2 to 15 million people. Unlike many on our list, Leopold II never personally ordered a single execution. Instead, he created a system so brutal that it would inspire Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and become a model for colonial exploitation. In 1885, through clever diplomacy and outright deception, Leopold convinced the world's powers to grant him personal ownership of the Congo Free State, a territory 76 times larger than Belgium. He never set foot there. Instead, he established a private army and turned the entire country into a rubber harvesting machine. The horror came with the rubber quotas. Villages that failed to meet their quota would be punished collectively. Officers were required to provide a severed hand for every bullet spent to prove they hadn't wasted ammunition on hunting. This led to a grotesque economy where hands became currency. Villages would raid each other for hands when they couldn't meet quotas. The death toll was staggering. Entire regions were depopulated. Between murder, starvation, disease, and plummeting birth rates due to family separation and abuse, the Congo's population dropped by perhaps 50% during Leopold's rule. 8 Heinrich Himmler 1900 to 1945. Death toll 6 million people. Perhaps no other figure better represents how ordinary people can become architects of genocide. Himmler started as a chicken farmer and failed fertilizer salesman. By 1945, he had created the most efficient killing machine in human history. What made Himmler unique was his bureaucratic approach to mass murder. He created a system where killing became just another office job. Trains had to run on schedule. Quotas had to be met. Papers had to be filed in triplicate. Under his leadership, the SS transformed from a small guard unit into a state within a state. complete with its own military, business empire, and research institutes. His personal diaries reveal a man who could order the deaths of thousands in the morning, then go home to tend his herb garden and read bedtime stories to his daughter. He was obsessed with appearing decent and clean while orchestrating the Holocaust. He even complained about the psychological burden mass shootings placed on his men, which led to the development of gas chambers as a more humane method of killing. 7. Ismail Enver Pasha, 1881 to 1922. Death toll 2.5 million people. Enver Pasha represented a new breed of military dictator, young, modernizing, and nationalist. As part of the Young Turk movement, he helped overthrow the Sultan and drag the Ottoman Empire into the 20th century. But his dreams of restoring Turkish greatness would lead to disaster. His decision to join World War I on Germany's side proved catastrophic. In the winter of 1914 to 1915, he personally led an army of 95,000 men against the Russians in the Caucasus Mountains. His poor planning led to 75,000 Turkish soldiers freezing to death before they even reached the battlefield. But Enver's most notorious legacy was the Armenian genocide. Blaming Christians for the empire's military failures, he helped orchestrate what would become the template for 20th century genocide. Armenians were first disarmed, then their leaders were arrested and killed, and finally, the general population was forced on death marches into the Syrian desert. 6. Mengistu Haile Mariam, 1937. Death toll 1.5 million people. Mengistu's rise to power reads like a Shakespearean tragedy. After helping overthrow Emperor Haile Selassie, he turned on his fellow revolutionaries in a series of purges that would become known as the Red Terror. His preferred method of elimination became known as necklacing, forcing victims to carry their own execution devices. He would personally execute political opponents in public, firing the first shot to show his commitment to revolution. What makes Mengistu unique on our list is that he's still alive, living in comfortable exile in Zimbabwe. Despite being sentenced to death in absentia by an Ethiopian court, he has never faced justice for his crimes. Don't miss out! Explore our handpicked true crime recommendations, links in the description. 5. Kim Il-sung, 1912 to 1994. Death toll 1.6 million people. Kim Il-sung created perhaps the most enduring personality cult in history. Every North Korean home is still required to have his portrait. His body lies in state in a glass coffin, and he remains the country's eternal president despite dying in 1994. But behind the propaganda lay a system of institutional terror unmatched in modern history. His Songbun system divided the population into 51 categories based on family background, affecting everything from food rations to job opportunities. His prison camps operated on the principle of 3 generations of punishment. If you committed a crime, your children, parents, and grandchildren would also be imprisoned. Number 4. Adolf Hitler, 1889-1945. Death toll 17 million people, not including WW2 military casualties. Hitler's rise to power shows how democracy can die through legal means. A failed artist and wounded WWI veteran, he masterfully exploited Germany's economic crisis and wounded national pride to transform a small radical party into a movement that would plunge the world into war. What made Hitler particularly dangerous was his understanding of mass psychology. He wrote, "The crowd is like an animal which obeys instincts. It is not moved by arguments, but by emotions." His speeches were carefully staged theatrical events using lighting, music, and crowd dynamics to create an almost religious atmosphere. The Holocaust didn't begin with gas chambers. It began with words, dehumanizing Jews, the disabled and others as life unworthy of life. This gradual progression from discrimination to extermination shows how genocide usually develops in stages, each step making the next seem more acceptable. Number 3. Joseph Stalin, 1878-1953. Death toll 20 to 25 million people. Stalin transformed the Soviet Union from an agricultural society to an industrial superpower at the cost of millions of lives. Born Joseph Jugushvili in Georgia, he adopted the name Stalin, meaning man of steel, and lived up to it through ruthless determination. His forced collectivization of agriculture led to the Ukraine famine of 1932-33, known as the Holodomor. Farmers who resisted had their grain confiscated at gunpoint. Desperate people resorted to cannibalism. Villages that failed to meet quotas were blacklisted and left to starve. The Great Terror of 1937-38 showed Stalin's paranoia at its peak. The Soviet secret police would arrest people based on quotas. They literally had to find a certain number of enemies each month. People were encouraged to denounce neighbors, creating a climate of fear where no one was safe. Number 2, Genghis Khan, 1162-1227. Death toll, 40 million people. Born Temujin, Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes through a combination of military genius and brutal efficiency. His empire introduced many innovations we take for granted today: international postal system, paper money, and diplomatic immunity. But his methods were ruthless. Cities that resisted were completely destroyed, their populations massacred. His armies would sometimes divert rivers to flood cities or use plague-infected corpses as biological weapons. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm was so complete that Persian civilization never fully recovered. Interestingly, his conquests had an unexpected environmental impact. So many farming areas returned to forest that global carbon levels dropped, creating a small ice age. It's estimated that his conquests removed about 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere. Number 1, Mao Zedong, 1883-1976. Death toll, 40 to 75 million people. Remember that number we mentioned at the start? Mao's Great Leap Forward represents the deadliest miscalculation in human history. His attempt to industrialize China overnight led to the largest famine ever recorded. Farmers were forced to melt down their tools to meet steel quotas, leaving them unable to harvest crops. Local officials, fearing punishment, reported record harvests while people starved. In some areas, people resorted to eating tree bark and clay. Parents would swap children with neighbors to avoid eating their own. The Cultural Revolution that followed might have been even more destructive to Chinese society. Schools were closed for years. Students were encouraged to attack their teachers. Ancient temples and artifacts were destroyed. The country's intellectual and cultural heritage was nearly erased. What haunts me most isn't just the scale of these atrocities, it's how ordinary people became part of the machinery of death. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Communities that had coexisted for generations were torn apart by manufactured hatred. But here's what gives me hope. For every person who chose cruelty, there were others who risked everything to save just one life. Every genocide survivor exists because someone chose compassion over compliance. We tell these stories not to sensationalize evil, but to recognize the warning signs in our own time. Because the greatest tragedy isn't just what happened to those millions of victims, it's that it could happen again if we forget. Which of these stories affected you most? Share your thoughts below, and please subscribe so we can continue having these important conversations together.